Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's Divinity School Dean's Forum, a celebration of both scholarship and community. We are gathered today to mark the publication of Amarāvatī, Art and Buddhism in Ancient India, this wonderfully yellow book, a wonderful color, among other things, a major work by our distinguished colleague and visiting professor, Jaś Elsner. We at the Divinity School are honored to count Jaś as part of our intellectual community. As a visiting professor of art and religion, he also holds now for 22 years, you said 22 years at the university in art history and in the Div School. And going into the future for many years to come, God willing. He also holds the position of Humphrey Payne Senior Research Fellow in Classical Archaeology and Professor of Late Antique Art at Oxford University, and is an internationally recognized scholar for his contributions to the study of ancient art and its entanglements with religion, ritual, and cultural history. This book, Amarāvatī, is the culmination of more than a decade of careful study and critical reflection, and I believe interaction with scholars here at the University of Chicago and elsewhere. In it, Jaś turns his characteristically probing eye toward one of the most significant and enigmatic traditions in South Asian Buddhism. The Amarāvatī stupa was once one of the grandest monuments of early Indian Buddhism. Its richly sculpted reliefs, some of which now reside in museums worldwide, offer a tantalizing glimpse into the worlds of ancient artisans, pilgrims, and patrons, and the devotional and visual cultures that flourish around them. Jaś's work, Professor Elsner's work, does more than reconstruct a historical monument. It invites the reader to think about how images function in religious life, how meaning is made in and through artistic form, and how our modern categories of art, religion, and history both illuminate and limit our understanding of the past. In other words, this is a book that sits at the heart of what we do here in the Divinity School in Swift Hall. It is therefore fitting that we have Professor Christian Wedemeyer, Associate Professor of the History of Religions at the Divinity School, joining us today as the respondent. Christian, as many of you know, is a longtime faculty member here, someone I've known for exactly as long as I've been at the University of Chicago, is a longtime faculty member here, a scholar of esoteric Buddhism, and someone deeply attuned to both the historical complexity and contemporary significance of religious traditions. His insights will no doubt add a rich layer of conversation to our gathering this afternoon, and I won't put him on the spot to say that he is the expert respondent, but he is good. Events like this one are a reminder of the intellectual vibrancy of this community, the kind of thoughtful, exacting, and creative work that defines the Divinity School. They are also an occasion to pause and appreciate the ways our faculty, students, and visiting scholars help to expand the boundaries of what it means to study religion in all its forms. With that, I wish to invite and welcome Professor Elsner to the podium. He will speak for a few moments about the book as a whole, introduce us to it, and provide framer. Christian will respond, Jaś will respond to the response, and it will be open for discussion.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored and delighted to be here. You might wonder why someone who really knows something about early Christian art and late antique art of the Mediterranean should be standing here talking about this. And so this is it's a strange business that I ended up working on. This is such as we can reconstruct of the Amarāvatī stupa. I'd long been interested in the Buddhist art of India, and indeed Indian art in general, which is so beautiful. And then I ran a project for the British Museum called Empires of Faith, in which we had an exhibition in the Ashmolean Museum in the end, where one piece from Amarāvatī was displayed, a pair of wonderful footprints. And in fact, the figure of Wendy Doniger sits there. I remember talking to her about footprints, and she was very vivid about how one has to prostrate before them. So, I mean, I should, of course, have prostrated before her, but that's a different matter. So this piece was vivid in my mind and memory. And then we had a conference, and somebody spoke about Buddhist art, and we were publishing a book from the conference, and that person dropped out. And so we were at a point where you have a project that is about Eurasia that needs a foot in the East, or a footprint, or a double foot in the East, and nobody to supply it. So being the editor and running the project, I didn't have any option. So that is how I initially got into it, and I wrote about the footprints, in Amarāvatī there's quite a bunch of them. And that was fine, because it was, in a way, a curtailed piece, and within a larger book, and it's the kind of thing nobody notices, so it's okay. And then the next thing was March 2020. And I was busy at the time, virtually daily negotiating with the then dean of this school, David Nierenberg, about should I get on a plane or not. And he was very keen I should, but it was very good that I didn't. Anyway, and then there was all the fuss about starting teaching and how we would teach and inventing Zoom and all that stuff. Meanwhile, in Oxford, everything closed, absolutely everything closed. There was no library open, and I was in a position, the kind of work I normally do is work where you need lots of, a whole bunch of different books with iconography, different texts. You can't easily do it without a library. And so really I couldn't do anything. And then it occurred to me that I had this interest in Amarāvatī, and why not buy the books, because there are not that many. And the one thing that still worked was Amazon. And they even go to space now, right? And the other thing that, and you could also buy books from India. They took 6 weeks, but they came. And so actually I was able fairly easily and not at enormous expense to buy second-hand or first-hand or whatever, the key volumes. And so I just sat down and started reading and getting into it in detail, object by object, art historically, archaeologically. And then there came a point where, in order to understand what it was that I thought I was learning, I had to write it down. And that eventually became this book. So it's a strange process. It's the result of a kind of sort of self-supervised second PhD kind of project, force majeure by the world in a particular situation. And really, libraries didn't properly open up until at least a year after, and we had more shutdowns and all the rest of it. And so that explains the peculiarity of the book before you. And so what was I trying to do? I was trying to understand, first of all, how the fragments and the bits, perhaps 10% of the original, that now survives, scattered between a number of museums. Again, it was a very odd project. I had to go to India to look at it after I'd written most of the stuff, which is the wrong way round. But that was how the world was. So one thing was just to understand the object. And it is wonderful stuff. The art is incredible. And then the second thing was I was very struck by the fact that Buddhology and the scholarship on Buddhism, which is actually rich, in Indian Buddhism this is rather than all of it, but very rich, very strong field, but it's hardly visual. There's hardly anything on the visual and material culture, whereas the archaeological, art historical literature has almost no grasp at all of the Buddhology or the complex of the textual traditions. And these are horribly complex textual traditions because most of it is lost, and most of we can't, and we have to reconstruct this and that from something else which is analogous, the usual, as it were. So there was this extraordinary gap or impasse between two fields which were obviously the same field. That is to say, the idea that these great monasteries, which built extraordinary monuments with works of art, many of the people donating and commissioning and so on, being monks, were somehow completely divorced from the production of the material, and also looking at the way the material thinks its Buddhism, if you want to allow works of art to think, seemed to me very natural and interesting. So that's, in a way, what I think the book is about. But we're soon going to hear what Christian thinks.
Thank you so much. Except to the dean, you're supposed to lower expectations, not raise expectations. It is a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to engage with my colleague Jaś Elsner and his recent contribution to the interpretation of South Asian Buddhist art and religion. There's no images from me, at least we do have, our art historian has brought an image here. I was, as a textualist, thinking more about just the absence of it, and in fact one of the dramatic things about the Amarāvatī stupa is that it essentially doesn't exist anymore, right? It's an empty space. And part of what the service that Jaś has done for us is to bring this stupa back to life in image and print. So this book, although it is Buddhism, is not my usual fare insofar as it takes an art historical perspective, which I am not fluent in. To the extent that the book articulates and justifies a particular approach to the interpretation of material visual culture, it exemplifies a particular approach to the study of Buddhism. This approach has been one that the larger field of Buddhist studies has struggled properly to comprehend alongside and in dialogue with the interpretation of the literary products of these communities. While the early study of Buddhism in the 19th century tracked closely contemporaneous work in classical Greco-Roman antiquity, involving integrated study of text, inscription, and monument, in the 20th century, scholarship on the Buddhist traditions tended overwhelmingly to focus on textual sources, leaving painting, sculpture, and monument, often even inscription, to art historians, to the impoverishment of their results. Of all the material remains of Buddhism, stupas, also called chaityas, pagodas, topes, and other terms, I would argue stupas are the most important architectural form by far, and a crucial site for the performance of Buddhist sociality. In his book, Elsner draws our attention to one exquisite example of this type of site from Andhra Pradesh, the stupa of Amarāvatī, that features a remarkable program of iconography and a distinctive regional plan. As Elsner indicates, there is in the iconographical program a marked focus on the life and lives of the Buddha and other Buddhas, of stupas themselves, including probable representations of itself on itself, and he leverages that interpretation quite a bit, and the cosmographical and theological concepts that were developed and debated. And he argues the stupa should be read as part of that debate itself. Part of the problem with construing stupas and archaeological sites of ancient India in general as historical data is the sorry history of their excavation. Like those of ancient Rome, many of them were plundered over centuries for repurposing building materials, providing ballast for railway lines or foundations for bridges over rivers, leaving catch as catch can for scholars to explore. When they were excavated, it was largely a form of grave robbing. British civil servants, many with a knowledge of Greek and Latin and the Greco-Roman remains, digging into the center of stupas to extract the prize in the middle in the form of a relic casket. And stupas are, as Elsner indicates, primarily a monumental reliquary. Mostly, these contents are actually uninteresting in themselves, if sacred. Basically, some beads and trinkets and a little bit of gold. Though the form of the container of those relics itself, as Elsner indicates, frequently in the form of a stupa, the stupas that contain them, can often be very illuminating. The book has 7 chapters. After introducing the site and its interpretative challenges, including the utter lack of anything like stratigraphy or other contextualization of the finds, even down to the order of the narrative panels around the stupa, Elsner gives a verbal walkthrough of the site to offer a phenomenological, i.e. first-person perspective on what it might have been like to visit the monument by a devotee during its heyday. He then, in chapter 2, spends a little time on donative inscriptions, highlighting the personalized and decentralized nature of the funding of the monument. Each panel, railing, or small piece was individually sponsored and labeled accordingly. He speaks less of any centralized planning, which I think we must assume at some level, and I'll get back to that, and downplays royal patronage, which strikes me as a little odd, and perhaps he might address this in his remarks after this. The ambivalence of Buddhists historically, many wanting to aspire to selfless donation as an ideal, and others, even most, eager to cash in karmically and socially by announcing their largesse, is something perhaps also to be observed here, though most of the evidence in the nature of things supports the second being very active in Amarāvatī, people very anxious, as for instance contemporary Chinese Buddhists are, to label everything that they give with their name. And there is still today some ambivalence about this practice. In chapter 3, Elsner explores the range of representations of the Buddha and his career, and the manner in which the stupa reliefs communicate concepts important to the Buddhist teaching and models of a life well lived. An important claim, here and throughout the book, is that the stupa represents a visual record of contemporaneous thinking and debate on doctrinal issues that one also sees debated in verbal form in Buddhist scriptures and commentaries. He advocates viewing the stupa as itself a kind of commentary and gives some suggestive readings. The fourth chapter attempts to relate the experience of stupas and their worship to contemporaneous practice of theater in India. This is a very innovative discussion to my mind and can enrich current scholarship on Buddhist scriptures and their relationship to scripts and performance. This is something that's very active in interpretation of Mahayana scriptures at present. This is followed by a chapter on the cosmography of the stupa, arguing that it represents an evolving Buddhist understanding of a vast, interpenetrating set of parallel universes. Here, too, he suggests that some of the decision-making in the tradition was conducted in stone and not merely on palm leaf. The last section, in 2 chapters, focuses on the motif of the Buddha's feet, which here receive a thorough and insightful treatment, suggesting that there is an interesting dialogue in stone between stylized non- or superhuman feet and naturalistically depicted feet. Elsner suggests that these styles may be correlated in part with evolving conceptions of the bodies of a Buddha that contemporaneous Buddhists were struggling to understand as partly concrete and partly transcendental. The stylized feet, if I understand his argument correctly, represent the ideal superhuman source body of the Buddhas, the source for a kind of docetic conception of the Buddha, right, that he emanates out a set of dirempted Buddhas, if you will. So the stylized feet represent the ideal superhuman body, the docetic Buddha who emanates into concrete forms. Throughout, the book exemplifies the challenges of relating and interpreting 2 sets of data, textual and visual resources. As a responsible art historian, Elsner tends to be shy about overconfident assertions that any given picture depicts one or another textually realized narrative or idea, but he is not so shy about suggesting such intertext as a possibility. And as he just indicated in his remarks just now, his contribution as he conceives it is in part to unify these 2 sets of interpretative data. One theme I'd like to learn more about is the subtext throughout that seems to advance the hypothesis that this stupa represents a proto-Mahayana period with indications of Buddhological and cosmological ideas characteristic of the later Mahayana explored and tested in visual representation, and that the constraints of visual form may have conditioned the conceptual form that they took in words found in the literary sources. Elsner never makes this claim baldly, but he returns again and again to Nagarjuna and emptiness and multiple Buddha bodies and hints about the Mahasangika school as a source matrix for the Mahayana. Elsner disclaims wanting to make such an argument. He disclaims any interest in origins at all, but it seems to me that he does want to and essentially does make this argument. Yeah, that's something we could talk about. Another interesting challenge raised by the book is that of articulating a manner in which one might reconstruct the so-called interpellation of subjects or subjectivities by the presence of the monument and its communicative registers. I have attempted something similar with Mahayana Sutra literature, arguing that there are at least implicit representations of the reader in the texts of the tradition with normative implications, to the extent that the reader believes that it is he or his that is represented there. Here, in this book, Elsner argues that by interpolating the stupa itself in miniature representation throughout this program, all over the monument, the stupa itself represented in the act of being interacted with in normative ways, the authors of this stupa sought to likewise generate ideal subjects and subjectivities. Turning to topics for discussion, and the argument that the stupa may, even should be read as a text in stone, and a trace in some fashion of debates in the community. One would like to learn more, or I would like to learn more, I'll own that, about the conceptions and execution of the iconographical program. It seems that Elsner's argument depends on some decentralization, as indicated in his discussion of the individual patrons of the pieces of the various friezes. Yet it seems to me that there is no way such an expensive, labor-intensive undertaking could have been realized without extensive planning. Experts would have been called upon to set out a program which would then be executed by craftsmen. So I would assume a preset, evolved past participle understanding, not evolving understanding, which I think is the argument that Elsner is in part attempting to make. So what evidence is there to suggest that this, in fact, might be, as Elsner argues, the trace of a debate rather than a set of established conclusions fixed in stone? I suppose one possibility would be that maybe the whole structure was centrally planned, but the iconographic program was ad hoc and people kind of throwing up things as they became available. But I'd like to hear more from the expert on this. It seems to me that part of the challenge not having any ordering of these things is that we may not see larger patterns and interrelations that might have been there had we had the order. And so it seems somewhat random. But still, it seems to me unlikely that a royal and at least a centralized hand would have been more in play. A few brief provocations, just maybe to get discussion started. I wonder what more can be done with the Roman comparison, given our author's expertise. Again, it seems to me both in the experience of the excavation, the relationship of the contemporaneous communities to their ancient past, that there are conceptual connections that could be drawn there as well. I'm curious about the lack of ordering. This is a case that Elsner makes a few places, that we have no way of reconstructing the order of these. And it occurs to me that in Gandhara, which is an example, a comparative example you often use, scholars have actually been able to reconstruct a unique syllabary from that region, the so-called Arapatsana syllabary, in part through labeling of the parts of stupas, that they would put letters on pieces so that the craftsmen knew how to put them together. And it strikes me as odd, or at least noteworthy, that seems not to have been the case at Amarāvatī, and how that might have worked to not have, again, labeled, paint by numbers kind of things, as many places do. Totally out of the blue, I'm wondering if you compare northern and southern styles, and I'm wondering if there might be some reflection of diet in that. Is there a predominance of rice motifs, given that rice is the predominant cereal grain in the south, as opposed to wheat being the predominant cereal grain in the north, where the other stupas you discuss were? Pretty random there. But I'm also curious about the larger ecosystems. You mentioned Barhut and Sanchi, but you don't mention Abhayagiri in Sri Lanka, and a whole set of stupas. And I'm not sure when the full realization of Abhayagiri happened, but its origins are at least roughly contemporaneous with Amarāvatī. And at the time, I'm pretty sure Abhayagiri Stupa was the largest human-made structure other than the Great Pyramid of Giza in the early first millennium. So pretty important fact for the people who were in Amarāvatī. And so maybe you could say a little bit more about the larger ecosystem of these huge brick monuments throughout southern India and Sri Lanka. Finally, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek maybe, you discuss the existence of non-human beings in the representations of the stupa as part of its cosmology, and the idea that the imaginaire of the community involves a whole set of invisible beings participating in that world. But I wonder about the existence of non-human beings in the real world of the stupa, especially in your discussion of the entryways, which we see here. And these are contrasted with a model in which these are curved, and so the entranceway is from the side, which he suggests is a swastika pattern, plausibly. Might the entranceways be oriented in such a fashion that they were meant to exclude animals from accessing the site, rather than the art historical explanation that you give that they provide a kind of framing reference for the stupa? So there's some interpretative detail that Elsner goes into in terms of reconstructing the phenomenology of the vista that gets realized as one enters. But it strikes me that even, certainly the ones that are curved that way, but even this narrow one strikes me as perfectly well designed to keep cows from wandering in there and messing up the internal thing. So it's not that there has to be one explanation of the other. They could be, simultaneously useful, but that occurred to me. Anyway, this is a stimulating book, and one of the only ones that is centered on the comprehensive reconstruction of this exquisite and monumental site of Buddhist practice and devotion. Elsner brings a sensitive historical and visual vocabulary and a range of relevant sources to bear in bringing to life this lost gem of Buddhist architecture, which certainly deserves the detailed, even loving treatment Elsner provides us, and more. Thank you.
Well, you've got a point about cows. If you go around the stupa sites of South India, which are many of them pretty well abandoned, what you find is cows. So there may be something in it. I thought, by way of opening it out a little bit, let me just show you a bit. Here's one of those reliefs that Christian was talking about, which are all around the bottom part of the drum. You can see they're emulated here. This is the one in best condition. It survives. It's in Chennai now, and you can see the stupa reflects on itself stupas like itself, images of stupas like itself with the same kinds of gates and different figures in the gateways. None are exactly the same as the others. Here are the divine beings I was talking about. I only wish there was a flying cow. Anyway. And these panels were then between columns with the Dhammachakra and friezes at the top. So the whole, all around the thing, there were more than 100 of these. Perhaps 30 survive in part or in whole, including the drawings that were made in the beginning of the 19th century. Now, I just wanted to say something actually about the frieze at the top, to hint at something to do with this sort of creation, commentarial creation of a narrative that is not like anything we know in texts. So here you have 3 scenes, or if you include these 2, 5 scenes, but 3 main scenes, an empty throne with a series of effectively naked ladies around it, the seated Buddha or Bodhisattva in the center here, and an empty throne with the Bodhi tree above it and surrounded by female figures at the bottom worshipping, and some monks behind. On the 2 sides we've got a Naga king and queen venerating the central scene. And the one thing that we don't know in this particular panel, you can see that the central lotus boss in the dividing scenes, you can see that it's actually historiated. However, there is no existing photograph good enough to tell what those images are, and it's too high. I got on a chair in the museum. It's too high to see properly. The light is too bad, and my photographs didn't work. So there is in this thing still a fundamental missing link which would be soluble if it were properly photographed, which it never has been. Now, what's interesting here then, I would want to argue, are two aspects. First of all, the thematic of the naked lady, which goes right across. And these scenes have tended to have been identified as, this is the Buddha Bodhisattva in his harem before he leaves. So it's the world of sense desire that he's about to abandon. Here, you've got the temptation by Mara before his enlightenment, in a very particular scene that is actually not in any of the southern tradition, but in the Lalita Vistara as given, where Mara sends his daughters in their most alluring form, as it were, to knock him off his perch. Of course, he backs them away. But anyway, there are the daughters of Mara. And finally, this very interesting scene, let's see. There you've got the harem, and here you've got the other two. So they're the daughters of Mara on the right. Here, this one is very, very remarkable. The one on the left, because you have the Bodhi tree, but in the center, seated on the Bodhi tree, is a column with the Dharma chakra, with the wheel, which would refer not to the Enlightenment, but to the first sermon, the teaching of the Dhamma. And then you've got the ladies, which are a kind of line across this image. But then here, there's a very striking scene, which is iconographically shown in other images in the site, of a woman bringing a young boy to the throne. And I think that is the story 10, 11 years later. The Buddha goes back to the palace where he was, which he left, and his former wife, or his wife, sends the son, who was born on the day he left, according to the narrative, to ask his father for his inheritance. And the Buddha initiates him into the Sangha. Which is the beginning of the story of the beginning of the child Sangha. Now, what that then does to this scene is it turns it from, it's part of a narrative, of course, but it is also visually, as a kind of visual construct, an image of the Enlightenment, the Buddha, the Dhamma, that is to say, the giving of the teaching, and the Sangha, the inauguration of the Sangha, that is the Triple Gem. And that is a kind of highly symbolic, commentarial image, but it is constructed entirely through the manipulation of iconographies known in the site, turned into something exceptional. And so that's just to give, in a sense, a hands-on feel for the remarkable conceptual creativity of the visual as a kind of commentarial structure. So anyway, that's just to give it a bit more flesh, as it were, to what Christian was saying. Yes, shall we speak? I mean, do you want me to answer quickly some of the things Christian mentioned? The Roman comparison, yes, definitely, and I do plan to do. I felt that I had to show some expertise, enough expertise on the eastern side to be able to do a comparison. But I would like to do a comparative project on the birth of early Christian art from an ancient Mediterranean context and the birth of early Buddhist art from a multifarious Indian context. So that is in the back of my mind as something to do. You asked a very significant, well, you asked an interesting question about Sri Lanka. I thought Sri Lanka was a bit later, and that what we have is a tradition that this goes out, it goes there, and also towards Amarāvatī and towards it goes east and south. So in that sense, but perhaps I should have been more comparative and should have looked at Sri Lanka more deeply. And again, it's one of the things at the back of my mind. And so I certainly agree, and there's certainly connections. There's no doubt about
It may be that they represent more the northern examples that are kind of stucco and less relief, so less interesting.
Yeah, I mean, too. So now the question about some centralizing focus. Is it better for me to sit here? Can you hear me? Yes. I think that's obviously a key issue. I certainly think that there's obviously a central workshop for the production of this stuff, and so I have no problem about a centralizing focus. We have no evidence for kings in the inscriptions, but of course, I mean, we only have 10% of the stuff, so I mean, you know, we could have had endless royal inscriptions that are missing. We do know about kings in the great stupa that was found in Kanaganahalli, which is 1980s excavation, and there's some evidence of queens in Nagarjuna Konda. So, yeah, I mean, but you know, we just know so little. That's part of the problem there. Now, the Mahayana subtext. He accused me of being Boris Johnson. That is to say, having my cake and eating it. Boris's favourite phrase. The problem with the rise of the Mahayana is one of these great cookies that is insoluble. What we have, however, is 18 schools of pre-Mahayana Buddhism, of which the texts of one survive. And it's completely bonkers that the texts of that one are then used to reconstruct all the other 18, given that we know they were different, significantly different. Some of the other 18 survive a little bit, but mainly in Chinese or Tibetan. And certainly not holistically enough to be able to be definitively said what's going on with them. So this is this is a complex issue. The Mahasangikas are important for this because they are thought to be one of the groups that was in the site of Amarāvatī, but actually we don't really know. So we don't even know out of whose tradition this is being generated, but it's likely that there were some Mahasangikas around there. Then we have, you know, so Nagarjuna. Well, that's another one. You know, who was Nagarjuna? Where was Nagarjuna? When was Nagarjuna? And how many Nagarjunas? You name it. You can, you know, pull the things out of a hat. So some have said Is it more likely that he's in? Many have thought he was most likely in the south, but actually, so I have accepted that. But I mean, who knows? In the end, that's a very difficult one. I think that on the multiplicity of these images, I went to the Gandhavyuha Sutra, which is part of what becomes the great, ultimately Chinese tradition of the Avatamsaka Sutra, the Huayan school, which is an amazing, it's glorious stuff. And there you have the endless reflection of everything reflected in everything. But it's already in the Gandhavyuha, which people have placed originally in southern India, originally around the time of the stupa. But more proof than that is hopeless. But I wasn't trying to prove direct connection. I was trying to argue for, as you rightly said, creative, commentarial and speculative theological thinking in the culture, which is reflected in both the visual and the textual evidence, all of which are so fragmentary for us, and better known through Tibetan or later versions, which are of course themselves interpretative and have transformed what they started with. So that at least was the assumption now, and I have, I plead it with humility.
In the chapter about the Buddhapada, the Buddha's feet, the language you use reminds me of the language used to talk about Christ in some contexts, about how the Buddha was both human and superhuman. What other connections do you see between how these two bodies were conceived in relation to the human world, since you also work on early Christian art? And the second question I have is, since you started the project as a non-specialist, how did you overcome the linguistic barriers when when you encountered Prakrit content, for example?
Okay, I plead a fraud. So, if the buy-in to be allowed to do this is command of the languages, then I can't count. But it's more complicated than that, because commanding Prakrit or Sanskrit and Pali is immensely insufficient, since one would also need Chinese and Tibetan, and plausibly Korean and plausibly Japanese if you want to know the literatures. At which point you can see that you'd need another lifetime. I mean, fortunately, Buddhism would allow me to, but anyway, you can see. So this is a real issue, and it's not a dumb issue. And actually, in terms of the history of religions, it's deeply significant. But if somebody were to say, you really can't do this unless you can command those languages, I have to, say fair enough, because I can't. What I can do is, because I'm a classicist, I can tell when the Pali is written out in Latin, in Latin script, that a particular word there is the same as a particular word there, and even if they're translated differently in a translation. So I can go that, that is really bottom minimal philology, but at least it's having some sense of the philology. Though there was an interesting case where I had to do that, where the term naga, which means snake, is also the term used of elephant. And that's interesting in one of the stories of the Buddha. I could actually, I didn't have to believe what people told me. I could tell. But that's as far as my philology goes in this area. On the question of bodies, it's very interesting. So here we have two totally different cultures. They have no particular connection. There may be marginal links. We've discovered these Buddhas in Egypt, which are fascinating and have some kind of, certainly in Indian, and a bit of Sanskrit even. So there are movements, but in any case, no real link. But they are thinking about human and divine bodies and about these key figures, the savior figure, however you want to describe it, with more than one of these bodies. So that is happening, and that's something I want to pursue more. But one of the key differences is that we have a Christian model where the church gets rid of all the alternatives. So there are two natures for Christ. Come on, and you're in real trouble if you go for more. Whereas we have multiple potential bodies for the Buddha: the Dharmakaya, the Rupakaya, the Sambhogakaya, the Nirmanakaya, depending on the different traditions. And actually that's been well studied, reasonably well studied for the early schools, insofar as we can get a picture. Some have three, some have two. In other words, all flowers bloom. And that is a very different starting point. With clearly different schools with different philosophical traditions about this, must have different resonances about what the Buddha means for salvation. More than that, I'm not sure how much we can say. Christian may have a view.
So I have two questions, but I'm going to try to make them into one. I want to start with you, Jaś, and then I'm very interested to hear what Christian thinks. I know, Jaś, how affectionately you regard Jonathan Z. Smith and how informing he is for your work on religion. And I guess I want to know whether you think your brief for visual culture and the study of religion extends or in some way opens up possibilities vis-a-vis Smith's program that were not realized in his work. And if so, how does that look? And then, given what Jaś says, Christian, I want to know if you think he's got Smith right or not. How's that for you, Jaś?
How could one possibly get Smith right? First of all, so I'm thinking here now particularly with Drudgery Divine, which is the great comparative book. And actually the only book, I think it's the only thing he wrote as a book, as opposed to a bunch of essays put together here and there. Am I wrong?
Take Place would be the other.
That's also a
devoted
book.
monograph.
Yeah, okay. He doesn't do art. Boy, does he not do art. So that would be the first issue with Smith. And actually, but it's totally plausible for his project. Indeed, you could argue to be essential, because his is on the one hand a comparative project, on the other hand it's really about comparative historicism, that is to say Catholics versus Protestants. He doesn't do much for the Orthodox, and that's a problem actually. That's a mistake, I would say, because actually there's a whole Orthodox tradition which is neither one or the other. So it's three-way, not two-way. But the art is obviously Orthodox Catholic, and it's obviously highly problematic for the Protestants, depending on more or less Protestant. So that I would say that is one side of this for the Smith tradition. Now, of course, you could say one could do that in relation to our early Christian art. So that doesn't necessarily the material doesn't perhaps resonate with it. But the historiographic aspects, of course, are different and yet in some sense similar when you take it out of the ancestral tradition, which is the Smith project obviously there, and you put it into a colonial or other, or whatever, however you want to describe India in relation to the Smith project. And that's quite interesting. So first of all, there's no doubt at all that all those decent British gentlemen who dug up the Indian sites were obviously Protestant, and indeed the literature has been accused of being quite. His name has slipped out of my head, but the great scholar of all that early.
Cunningham?
No, modern. He's still alive, very old. He published in Honolulu all the time. What's his name? I've forgotten. Anyway, got a long beard. The great expert on Indian Buddhism. He published articles all the time. And it's just out of my head. Anyway.
Chopin.
Yes, exactly, Chopin. Has a whole article about the problem of the Protestantism of the field. And that obviously is a Smith-influenced article. But I think he's right. But then you would have to inflect that historiography with issues of more anthropological issues of colonialism and so on and so forth, which inflect the different approaches. But I would say that in that sense, this is a Smithian project, and maybe more so when I get round to trying to compare the two sides.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good read on the Smithian aspects, and I'm inclined more to focus on Elsner's arguments. I think it's Smithian in the sense that both bring essentially a semiotical perspective to bear, right? That these are complex sets of signs. And maybe it has a certain affinity to take place insofar as the stupa itself raises the question of locative orientation and what sites mean for Buddhists rather than Buddhism being floating out somewhere. I mean, my initial kind of provocation about the stupa being the crucial, most important site was kind of gesturing in that direction, because I think there is a really important way in which it is the paradigmatic place for Buddhists to come together as Buddhists. But I think what's really challenging about Elsner's book here is he's trying to get us to think about a whole set of social strata at this site who would have brought to that site different reading programs and different skills, from the literate to the highly illiterate to the highly literate, and the really interesting challenge, which is what I was trying to explore a little bit in my remarks, is this idea that it's not just pre-prepared, pre-digested understandings that are being displayed for the illiterate, but rather because visuality is itself a conceptual vocabulary, that there's a way in which the work of the tradition gets done in visuality. And again, my problem is, given how expensive it is, how does that work on the ground? I love the suggestion. I mean, as a methodological program, it seems to me very cogent. I'm just, skeptical, right? Methodologically, so that's, I guess, maybe how I would try to bring those two together.
Your discussion about how you could write this project, the origin of it and the development of it, and also Christian's response really brought up the issue of the limitations, but also the possibilities of cooperative scholarship. And of course, this book is distinctly pandemic. It's a book born of the pandemic, which is isolation, and separate. In our world, of course, post-pandemic, we have Zoom, which creates incredible opportunities for cooperative work across area and across field and across country, across the world. So, so a little odd question, but maybe it was part of Christian's response. A hypothetical question. If you could have read the literature related to it, how different of a book could it have been? What do you see as the gaps in it that result from your limited understanding of the literary culture that produced this world? And how, Christian, could your expertise have changed it, perhaps? And those were where some of your questions came from. But is it, in some ways, this book, an extraordinary achievement and a great example of inventing oneself anew constantly throughout one's field? But also, is it like a plea for more cooperative research across area and across field to do something that really is greater than the sum of the parts of people contributing?
Well,
So a reflection on method and practice.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the key problems with collaborative work is it requires actually almost, you might say, equal levels of buy-in by the parties involved. So, until I'd, in a sense, done the individual work of, at least, well, the work I did to get to this, I don't think I would be fit to have a conversation with Christian around this area, if you see what I mean, because it would have been without the knowledge. So I think that there's a necessary level for the, if you like, individual. But I think at this point, from my point of view, that broader conversation with people who have different views on Mahayana, with a whole, whatever is being really thought through about these relatively new Gandhari texts in the north, all this kind of thing, at that point you really do need the collaborative model, and I think it's totally fantastic.
And so this should really be followed by another volume of collected essays in response to the book from
what a
different
good idea.
perspectives.
My perspective on that would be, there's a bit of lowering of expectations going on here, and there's a tremendous knowledge and sensitivity of Buddhist literature that's brought to bear here, and he ticks the right boxes in terms of, again, cautiously, skeptically, but suggesting intertexts with the available literature. And in some sense, the problem raised about the languages is a problem and collaboration endemic to the history of religions, who are constantly, insofar as they're doing their job, poaching on someone's terrain. And the enemy of the historian of religions is always the narrow-minded specialist who says, oh, you can't possibly open your mouth about this subject matter because you don't understand the 10 monographs that have been done on the verbal prefix in, Andhra, at the time. And this kind of impossible level of policing of boundaries, rather than excitement about, potentially mistaken and misguided, but nonetheless, fruitful provocations by people who are collaborating or poaching or whatever the case may be.
But I would also hope, for example, that something similar could be done with Gandhara, for example, to look at because it really doesn't exist, a Buddhological model for thinking with Gandhara materials. Similarly, it's never been done with the other stupas, or Ajanta and Ellora. So there are possibilities, and obviously, these are from different Buddhist traditions, one way or another. So I think even there's a richness of pursuing something of this.
I feel like I should not ask the last question because it's more of a nerdy question. But when I've seen you present this before, I always have been struck by these miniature stupas. And Subhashini Kalagotra, just wrote a monograph where one of the chapters is on microarchitecture. And so this idea of the sort of microarchitecture is something that isn't Buddhist, right? It's just a shared vocabulary, artistic vocabulary in pre-modern South Asia. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about this in that larger context, because I think it's really interesting. And as much as I've seen it sort of reoccur, still don't actually have a firm grasp on what's going on there in terms of the visual program. So yeah.
So you're totally right about that. And in fact, it's quite possible that the stupa as a construct is Jain before it's Buddhist. There are all kinds of difficulties in doing this kind of comparison. The place where I came closest to it actually was more around the theatrical side. But I totally, I mean, one of the great, if you do the comparative thing with Christianity and Buddhism, the great difference, the supreme difference is Christianity gets rid of, within a very, very short time, any of its competition. Whereas Buddhism, well, I mean, if you were an Indian, I'm not sure how different you think Jainism, Buddhism, Brahmanism really are. You've got to be a pretty precise practitioner of one or the other, but it is within one cultural dialogue. And that's constantly the case. And you know, so many of the suttas of the Pali tradition have various kinds of ascetics who aren't Buddhist ones in dispute one form or another with Buddhist ones, and Brahmins, Jains, you name it, whatever. And so that's essential. And I think that's true entirely of the visual forms, the cave form, the temple form, the stupa form. It's true. I mean, I'm sure it will be true of sculpture and of painting. Different ones take off earlier than later, and so on. But that's partly also a matter of what survives, which we, you know, all you need is find another site, and everything will change in that sense. So I would say that that's really a crucial starting point. That no Indian religion is an Indian religion in its own right. It's part of something more, much more, you know, it's like, in a way, like Ashoka's edicts with, you know, pay respect to each other, respect each other and get on with it, you know, and that's, you know, it's a good doctrine for our time. And, you know, I think that, and that is so different from the West. So the answer, in a way, to the plea in your question is yes. And it would be in many, many areas, but miniature architecture would be one.
How does all this relate to theater?
To theatre? Well, one of the interesting things, so if you take any of these scenes, any of the scenes there, say the Enlightenment, imagine this is the Enlightenment, doesn't take place on its own, it always takes place with extraordinary amounts of audience. And it's striking. Actually, it's not so different from Greek painted pottery, where, you know, even the sex scenes, everybody's surrounding, you know, it's actually quite it's a strange feature. And that isn't, so that the notion of a kind of theatricality, of a visuality around these things, which in this case, of course, is devotion, certainly by the time you get here, is really key. Now, then we have, so that then it gets more specific. I mean, we have these amazing texts, the Natya Shastra and so on, for Indian theatre, and there is the survival of some very weird space in Nagarjunakonda, which isn't far from Amarāvatī, which is maybe it's a debating hall, maybe it's a theatre, but it's certainly a space with steps on all sides. So there is a culture of some kind. It's been very, very difficult to identify theatres in the Indian archaeological tradition, but clearly they thought it hard in terms of the literary tradition. You know, this text is an amazing text. So I just think you have to think a theatrical world, a world where people pay homage, worship, and are watched worshipping by other people who worship, and I'm sure the gods are watching, etc. So theatricality in the broad sense, I think, is at the heart of Indian religious, cultural, at least representation.